Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 8 of Addressing Educational Equity. Now I think we actually are in the home stretch. So today we're going to be talking about some more low incidence populations. So we're going to be talking about homeless students, students in foster care, and English learners. Um, so probably some of y'all know and some of you might not know that the education of homeless students um, is obviously in a lot of ways similar to the education of non-homeless students, but what we have is a federal guidance, an unfunded mandate called the McKinney-Vento Act, which really is focused on how to best support the specific needs of homeless students in school. Um, it's changed a lot in the last couple years, so I'm going to talk some about that. When SS started, at the beginning of 2017, a lot of the rules changed. So even before we had to put the final plans and such into place for ESSA, it shifted over the expectations under McKinney-Vento. So there's block grants available on a state and local level for the requirements within the mandate, but students aren't sort of funded on a person by person level for it, and districts aren't necessarily funded on a district by district level. So there are state-based grants and local-based grants, and then those get dispersed to schools as needed for specific kids. And just for the numbers, there's 1.3 million students that are reported to have experienced homelessness during the 2013-2014 school year. I couldn't find a more official updated number, but if anyone else has one, I would love to hear. In terms of what the needs are, the information that we know is that grade school kids with more than 2 school moves are 2.5 times more likely to repeat a grade, and adolescents who experience school moves are 50% less likely to graduate from high school. I don't know who went into the additional stuff that I had put on the website a couple weeks ago, but there was that Harvard study that really breaks this down a little bit, pushes back somewhat against the idea that a lot of mobility is necessarily impactful to a student's uh, performance on tests, but the grade repetition is still there. Um, and again, we don't know. It's a little chicken and egg, right? Adolescents who experience school moves are 50% less likely to graduate from high school. That could be because their needs aren't getting effectively met in the high school. And it could be because there's so many other demands on them in the rest of their lives. But nonetheless, what we do know is that the school is the element that we can really impact the most as educators. So students experiencing homelessness are up to 9 times more likely than their non-homeless peers to repeat a grade. So that's, again, almost 4 times on top of how often uh, kids with 2 school moves are, you know? So just the more instability, the more challenging it is to make it through school. Um, Among students identified as experiencing homelessness, 17% had repeated at least one grade in this one study. And we know the pendulum has really swung right now to minimizing retention, especially once you get past first grade or so. So this number is pretty staggering. And part of why retention is happening so much less is because of studies like that grade repetition increases the risk of dropping out. So students who are held back almost 3 times as likely to drop out. So every time that this happens, these kids are more at risk, right? So housing and urban development division does this worst case housing needs report. So it's looking not just at people who are homelessness, but also people with a lot of housing instability, people who are very low income and having to live in housing that may look at taking 50, 100, even more than 100% of their income, and that they're going to have to scramble for outside sources every month. So it found that children experiencing homelessness are more vulnerable to mental health problems, to developmental delays, to poor cognitive outcomes, to depression. I mean, I think that this is no surprise to any of us, right? That a giant stressor like not having housing stability is going to impact a child, and that's going to impact their mental health. Children who are born into or experience homelessness early in life face many risks, um, and that those risks might last through their entire life, whether or not they remain homeless. It's a trauma, so we're thinking again about sort of all the ways that we do trauma informed education and trauma informed care and supports. And I think that what's key to me about this is that we need to be thinking about that trauma informed supports whether or not a student is currently homeless, right? If we know or understand that that was a part of their childhood, was a part of their early life, was present when they were born, that those impacts can still be there. More likely to use emergency department services because of a lack of a regular healthcare provider. Child welfare caseworkers say that for almost or 10% or more of the kids in foster care, that part of the reason was inadequate housing. We'll get a little more into the definition of inadequate or insufficient housing, but some housing that is deemed unlivable for a variety of reasons can trigger foster placements. So one thing that we obviously can't do in a school, but that we know policy wise and culturally makes a huge difference, is subsidized housing. There are huge, far reaching effects, huge reductions in family separations, in psychological distress. The school mobility goes down. So, yes, the trauma can still have an impact, but the amount of resilience that a kid can build and the amount of improvement that can happen in a child's life and the life of their family, the sort of buffer that they can build around them with just access to one key element, housing, makes a big difference. So when compared to their peers whose families were on the wait list for subsidized housing, so theoretically a pretty solid comparison group because they were previously those people, children in subsidized housing were more likely to be food secure, less likely to be seriously underweight, more likely to be classified as well on an indicator of child health, which is huge, right? Because all they're getting is housing. They're not getting other income, though often people will have more ability to access more income if they're housed and can sort of be doing things from that stability. But otherwise, their benefits are the same, their access to healthcare is the same. All of these things can be impacted just with this one element. That's why, as some of you may know, there is this housing first movement that basically says, what are we doing with homeless services if our main thing is not getting houses for people? Like, nothing else is gonna make the difference in that way. So the reason for that is because of this, the reduction in domestic violence, the reduction in food insecurity, the ability to keep families together, all of that. So back to the McKinney-Vento Act. So it provides protection and services to students experiencing homelessness, and school stability is the key thing that we really think of. The students who it includes, as of the 2017 change, it does not include children awaiting long-term foster placement. I'm going to talk a little more about foster placement in just a couple of minutes, but that is a group that used to be covered under McKinney-Vento and now has slightly different guidance. So this eligible student list is basically looks at homelessness. People can have nightly shelter and still be considered homelessness. So sharing other people's housing, um, so crashing on an aunt's couch for a long period of time, living in motels uh, because there's no alternative adequate accommodations, living in emergency shelters, abandoned in hospitals, um, a a primary nighttime residence that is not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings. So I think that the language of this used to be not designed for human habitation, but this is just to really clarify it can be a place that is fine for humans to habitate while they're awake. It's just not meant to be a bedroom, right? Living in cars, parks, public spaces, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, etc. So that's, I think, of a lot of what those last couple is what sort of gets talked about culturally as homeless, and then migratory children who qualify as homeless also. So I just put this in here. I think a lot of us have a sense of homelessness, but I just want to be clear that we as school districts are required to support students who may have somewhere that they are staying that is not actually considered housing by the federal government, and they would still be considered eligible for McKinney-Vento. Yeah, so the motels and the sleeping in other people's houses um, is really sort of the key elements for that to me. Also, living in substandard housing, which was part of that, and I said I would get back to that. So, does it lack a fundamental utility? Is it infested with vermin or mold? And that's obviously long time. It's not just like, oh, there was a mouse, now they qualify. It's pretty, it's much more ongoing than that, right? Lacks a basic functional part, like there's no toilet, unreasonable dangers, and you follow your own housing codes also. So I don't know what differences some of the individual housing codes in the towns have, but it's worth, if there's a kid who you think is falling on the line, it's worth trying to get all the information. One other note I wanted to make was because a lot of you have mentioned sort of homeless students that you've supported in the past. And so I just wanted to put in here because I know that in the schools I've been in and the homeless students that I've worked with, it becomes known, right, throughout the school, for better or for worse, because I think sometimes it's so that we can better support students. I just want to be clear that the status of being homeless is considered covered under FERPA. So it should be considered educational privacy and therefore on a need to know basis. I think that it is tricky to both maintain that and support students at the level that they might need. But I think it's also just worth us keeping in mind, like, especially when we're thinking about stigma, especially when we're thinking about what a student might be sort of facing that's already making them feel other or alienated in the context of school, just that per governmental regulations, this is considered confidential. And one last rule under MVA is that you can't segregate homeless students and you can't provide core education directly in the shelter. You can't, when we're looking at transport, right? You can't be like, you know what, it's more convenient to transport all the homeless students to elementary school A. So we're just going to pick everyone up and bring them over there. They are entitled to be in their neighborhood schools based on where their neighborhood school was initially. So that would be considered segregation. You are able to provide assistance like outside of school in the shelter and encouraged to, but not the core educational day. So, right, let's get to the key provision. It is that students retain access to their school of origin, and the district must provide transport to make that access a reality. So, one of the changes in the new MVA is that school of origin is the school the student is in now, but it's also a school where that would be their receiving school. So, say, um, I don't know. So let's say we're in Wilmington. I don't know how many of you are ever in Wilmington, but their schools switch over between second and third grade. So we've got a second grader at, say, the Shawsheen school. That would feed into the West school, but we can't suddenly be like, oh, well, now they're going to go to the North school starting third grade, just because that's, again, a more convenient location. The access to the receiving school, the school of origin, sort of tracks them where they go. But what I will say is that there is no clarity of how long this responsibility extends. What we know is that the responsibility defaults to extending at least to the end of the year. If a district thinks it should extend less than to the end of the year, there is a appeals process that you can go through with DESE, but it's unclear at this point how far out we go. Do we go out 2 years? I think that there's really good arguments to be made on both sides of that. But the presumption underneath this is that we work from the point that, on the whole, keeping the student in the school of origin is in their best interest. It provides one form of stability, it reduces transitions, but that doesn't mean it's 100% of the time true. So you can do an analysis to assess whether that's actually true. The impact on achievement of changing schools, the education, health, and safety of the homeless children, and what a student or guardian thinks is best, or if it's an unaccompanied youth, what the youth thinks is best, or if it's, well, I guess it's not going to be a youth in foster care anymore, so it doesn't matter what their government appointed people think is best. So we start from point, this is the best interest, and then we move from there, right? So, like, the default is this is the best interest, and maybe the default is this is the best interest until the end of the year. But maybe you've got a student who's accessing really specific supports, or has a really, really strong peer group, or who we think will probably end up moving back into that district. We might be like, let's extend it to the next year. Or maybe we've got a student who has been living in town X and is now homeless and staying in town Y, and it looks like that's where they're trying to actually move. There might be a decision based on everyone agreeing that, like, town Y actually makes more sense for the education. We would address that on an individual basis. So the other elements of what school districts have to do, they have to reserve funds for homeless youth and children. This transport isn't going to be free, right? It can be pretty expensive, and there's, like I said, the block grants, but those aren't guaranteed, and they're not student specific, so you could end up with more kids than you have block grant for. Provide educationally related support services in shelters and other places where kids live. That can be the school district doing it themselves. That can be making relationships with outside agencies that do that. Have policies and practices to ensure that the liaisons for homeless students participate in basically getting and keeping their skills up. And then can appropriately identify homeless children and properly enroll and retain homeless children. And so that would be in keeping with local and state regulations, as well as the federal pieces that we just talked about. And again, this is not Unsurprisingly, the McKinney-Vento Act doesn't go deep into the question of stigma, but I think that that becomes a big question here in terms of appropriate identification and appropriate enrollment and retention. I think that really making space for homeless students involves also looking at sort of our culture around that in each school. So, students in foster care, like I said, I was going to talk about this briefly. So, students in care are no longer covered under McKinney-Vento, and they do have some updated coverage of their own. It's exciting. So, they are there's also rules about limiting their educational disruption, which is the key goal of MVA. It's just been pulled out. So, in addition to the maintaining the school of origin for as long as needed, the other piece of it is enrolling in new schools without delay. And the assumption of best interest, that being in your home school is in your best interest, is still there. What I will say is that this regulatory guidance has been parsed a lot less than McKinney-Vento. There's a little more sort of like flex room. And I think that where it gets confusing to me is that often in foster care, so we have a foster care system that's trying to tighten up their timelines, right? So looking for at 6 months that a student will either be back with their family or in a permanent foster placement that will be leading towards adoption. But we know that these timelines aren't consistent and aren't totally realistic. So this guideline has a lot more wiggle room in terms of when do you um, when do you leave a student in one location versus when do you place them in a new spot, because we just have a lot of questions that we don't know the answer to in terms of that student's next steps, right? So, but there is transport written into it as a requirement. It's the responsibility of the state because this child is in state custody. So that should be the responsibility of their DCF worker, but the support and oversight comes from the district, the school of origin, the district of origin. Um, and also in these guidance, there's more focus on special education because students in foster care are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to receive services. So there's like about 600,000 uh, students that are currently in foster care. About 30% have below grade level basic reading skills and writing and basic skills in reading, writing, and math. This is from ASCD. It's an article from about 10 years ago. About 40% have repeated one or more grades. That number is down now, but I've only heard that anecdotally. I couldn't find a new specific number. The dropout rate is double that of students not in foster care, and there's also higher rates of absenteeism because of all the changes and because of being dependent on significantly longer transit, right? And that being at the hands of not licensed transit companies. It's the hands of their foster parents or their caseworkers. So it's a there's more ways that things can go wrong. And so then I just want to talk a little about English learners. So the number of English learners in the 11-year period stated here, and it's best I understand, has gone up from here. Though even the articles I'm reading from like 2016, 2017 keep stating this number from the Center for American Progress. So again, here I would also be interested if anyone has seen more updated statistics. I feel like with a lot of the stats in here, it's like they just went viral at one point and no one has, um, the newer stats haven't gone quite as viral. So that number increased by 51%, while the general student population only increased by 7%, which is just a huge chasm. And English learners, there's about 6 million English learners enrolled now, which is from a totally different study, enrolled in public schools, and that makes them the fastest growing student population. So the best sort of practices, as we talked about, the way that ESSA is set up, English learners are now being measured in terms of their skills within the larger realm of state assessments, however people are choosing to measure their progress for the federal government. But some best practices, and I know most of you all have done SEI training, right? So these should be pretty familiar. A double set of criteria for content versus language skills on assessments can be huge. So basically, the underlying part of this, which it's about to say, is that often either students aren't challenged enough in the classroom, or when they're in an English only setting, they can miss their content and they can be unable to catch up because it's just so much more of an uphill climb. And part of this gets to why students are so much more likely to be overrepresented in special education, because students can fall behind more quickly and catch up more slowly because of the language gaps. So yeah. So in your on Blackboard, in the additional resources, I shared some stuff about, it's a pretty comprehensive uh, study, I guess, about how English learning skills can be embedded into science in a particularly effective way to really activate what English learners might bring. I highly recommend reading that if you haven't already seen it. But I just wanted to list a few other possible accommodations, because accommodations is a lot of how we get towards equity, right? Is just recognizing that when students have specific needs, that that doesn't actually mean that they can't access the high expectations that we're having for everyone else, but it's just about how to get there. So a few of them that I listed here: allowing students to use a dictionary or thesaurus, giving students extra time, alternate methods of teaching and learning, allowing translations, but also just more specific things like modifying the text, obviously, creating really intentional grouping structures. One piece of advice that I heard actually a while ago is that often really good peers for students who need additional supports, like good peers within a setting, can be older siblings, like kids who are the oldest, because they can be more used to sort of flexing how they're talking about things. Targeting the amount and nature of student support. So figuring out how to use comprehensible input and then building from there. So this article I'm reading from, I wanted to read from an organization called Colorín Colorado, which is a bilingual site for educators and families of English learners. If you haven't looked at it before, I highly recommend it. They say specifically, comprehensible input means the student should be able to understand the gist of what is being said or presented. There are many ways to do this, such as selecting key vocabulary, using context or visual cues, building background knowledge, building on experiences the students have had, using consistent language, providing images or representations to support vocab and content. They can embed comprehensible input into whole group instruction, but also within the grouping structures. And then also just trying to sort of ensure a low anxiety environment, which can make students more able to take the risks of using their emerging skills, repeated practice, and also even using drama. I just wanted, after this, to look at some some words from a English learner. So if you can just go watch this video, just pause this and then come back to me. I'll give you a couple seconds to pause. And so your reflection that I'd love to hear is, I think that we're at a point now where more teachers that are not English learner specialists than ever have really strong sort of background understanding of SEI skills and English learners. And so, how much do you see at your schools or in your classroom that this work is happening throughout the classes versus just specifically the support coming from the ELL teacher? How I think that this gets back to some of the questions about feeling the risk, like the risk that we're asking students to take by using English skills. How well do you see yourself or other teachers in the school taking that risk to use these supportive skills for English learners? Thank you so much. One more online week to go after this, and then we get to see each other again. Thanks, everyone.